In any case, let's see what we can do with this, because I think all of us have been sitting back in the room muttering, but what about this, but what about that? And I don't know if I'll answer any of those questions now, but let's give it a whirl. I don't have any industry disclosures with regard to the subject of this meeting. I do want to mention the funding for a lot of the work that makes me interested in long-term follow-up, most importantly the Inborn Errors of Metabolism Collaborative, which is not only NIH funded but also has had strong support from partners from the regional genetics collaboratives, particularly our friends at NIMAC. And we're very, very grateful for the continuing support and activity from all of the named collaboratives here. All right, implications, air quotes, implications. I didn't even know what to say when I was asked to talk about the implications, but I will do my best. So I thought I'd summarize this by first talking about how we got here, then talking a little bit about where we are now, some of which is self-evident from what we've talked about, and then where do we go from here. And I hope we can have some discussion about, we're all among friends, so about where we think as a community this should go. All right, well, how did we get here? And I thought what we should talk about is why we're having this discussion in the first place. Why newborn screening? Just a reminder, because I think we kind of lose track of it when we get into the details of what tests we're doing and what the cutoffs are, and to remind ourselves of the criteria that we establish. Alex will go into this in more detail, and to remind you that newborn screening is a system, not a test. All right, this is a slide that I borrowed from Amy Brower, who has, she knows who this baby is, but I don't. But apparently someone gave us permission to have pictures of their little bloody foot. So, a reminder, this is a really successful public health program. People have devoted a tremendous amount of energy to do really wonderful things to save a lot of babies. And that's really where we're starting from. The disorders are ones that aren't apparent at birth. If we don't screen for them, we won't find them until they're symptomatic. Bottom line, if we're doing what we're supposed to do with newborn screening. Almost all of these at this point are identified using analytical techniques in public health laboratories. It's on the public health laboratory's head. We've heard about why it's more efficient and less expensive, but the bottom line is this is the decision we made as a society to have public health laboratories perform this important function. And of course, we have other things that aren't hospital-based, and that's a whole other tangle up in terms of keeping track of things. But it's a little reminder that keeping track of things is not as easy as you think it's going to be. All right. Also a reminder, and again, Alex will go through this in a little more detail, when we started thinking about newborn screening and adding additional disorders in a big way, everybody started with the so-called Junger and Wilson criteria. But remember, those criteria are really not designed for newborn screening. They were for population screening. And so they had to, when they decided to begin adding disorders to newborn screening panels to make it more just, more fair, more equitable for children, they had to revise those criteria based on newborn screening for diseases. And so there are some slightly different criteria beyond what's in the Junger and Wilson description, which include that treatment is available for the disorder screened. I'm just going to throw it out there. How are we doing with that on all of these? Think about it as you kind of enumerate them. The idea that early treatment improves outcome. Again, we should be thinking carefully about this as we consider when they're added. A routine diagnosis, an examination won't yield the diagnosis. So you have to have some testing to pick something up in an asymptomatic person. I think we're still going well with that. Rapid, highly sensitive tests. Well, we've been hearing a lot about those, and I think that part we do pretty well with. Screening is cost effective. Well, as we add more and more tests, I think we have to really continue to think about that, particularly with regard to the impact or burden of false positives. And here's the one I'm going to sort of stomp down on, which is Infrastructure exists to help families, medical homes connect with specialists for confirmation, treatment, and follow-up. Ooh, Nelly, the more you add and the more potential false positive you have, the harder and harder this one becomes to complete. All right. So the fundamental principles were that universal newborn screening is a public health good, that we should be centering on the affected newborn, that newborn screening is a system, not a test, that medical homes have to be engaged, that choices for screening should be scientific. We have problems with that too, so we'll come back to that point. Centralized data needed for follow-up assessment. How are we doing with that, folks? How's that going? Okay. Programs should have policies for storage and use of residual specimens. Again, how are we doing with that? Well, that's kind of blown up on us as well. Public awareness is a critical responsibility. That's something I think people have worked really hard to improve, but it remains a very big issue. And I really want to reemphasize this. Newborn screening is a system, not a test. That is applied in varying ways in different states because it's still all state by state, and that is a problem. All right. So forgive me. This is something I feel very strongly about, and that is long-term follow-up. And of course, when they published the additional suggestions for newborn screening, when they expanded the panel that we all ended up adopting, they reminded us that newborn screening is not just a test, it's a comprehensive system that includes a whole set of additional facets that we have applied to varying degrees of skill. And this one I also borrowed from Amy because it's one of my very favorite slides. It's not drawn to scale, but we tend to emphasize that first 6 months or a year or so where we're trying to figure out whether somebody has something. But then once we know they've got it, what are we going to do? And how are we going to be responsible toward them? And now we have an additional problem on top of that, which is that we have to follow up people who may never get sick or may never have something wrong. All right, so the first implications. I'm trying to give you some implications as we go through this. Newborn screening is a public health good. It has significant individual benefits for people who are identified by newborn screening. So this is a wonderful thing. We're doing good stuff. The conditions identified either have immediate health risks or longer-term but well-known consequences that are prevented or moderated by early diagnosis. That's what we hope for from newborn screening. And for better or for worse, and for however incompletely we did it, we actually endorsed a newborn screening process, not testing. We want to do the whole shebang. All right, whether we do that or not, another question. So where are we now? And I'm going to do this in two sort of parts, just to remind people. It's kind of like where were we and then where are we, but yeah, bear with me. All right, so newborn screening panels before the lysosomal storage diseases. We had 30 conditions, 2 point of care, 28, everybody was happy with that. I know that that's not true because honestly, we had some other bumps in the road, but states, as a general rule, had done a really good job with this. They were working to the tops of their capabilities to be able to add these in a just and fair way so that all children would be identified. Addition of SCID meant that we had to add some new methodologies, and that's still an ongoing process. Not everybody's been able to add that because it requires a whole different set of activities. But really, our testing abilities were coming along, particularly with the help of CDC. Everybody was moving out. Acuity of testing had become an emerging issue, and so everybody's trying very hard not only to do the tests very well, but very quickly, adding an additional level of pressure on the laboratories and on the system as a whole. I would think it's fair to say that we still have some uncertainties about what should be included in the what I'm going to call now, for want of a better term, the legacy panel. It's hard to call it that since we were thinking of 5 things as a legacy panel, and now we have 30 things that are legacy. But for example, 3-MCC deficiency is a primary target, but is it a disorder? I don't know, and we haven't really settled that. And of course, we have all these fabulous secondary targets that we still have significant numbers of that many states still hadn't made a commitment to or hadn't decided to report. And Long-term, I was going to rail for a while about how long-term follow-up was a mess, but I just put incomplete, and we'll leave it for that. We'll just leave it there. We have yet to sustain, we had not really sustained the expectations about newborn screening systems before we added anything else. All right, now, newborn screening with lysosomal storage disease type conditions added. Well, it certainly adds conditions that are not evident in birth. I think we fulfilled that expectation. I think that was good. The conditions may have neonatal or early infancy onset. We've heard that in spades today. Certainly for Pompe, early intervention is going to be life-saving and going to have improvements in outcomes. And I think there's a spectrum from that point on about whether you can really call these neonatal onset. And we hear MPUS 1, yeah, probably is an early enough onset that testing early is good, whether you have to do it in the first week after birth. Harder question to answer, but we'll give it early infancy. Effective treatments. I think we can argue pretty well that Pompe has some very effective interventions that have been good, particularly if they're applied very quickly. I remain less certain about how to judge interventions for MPS 1. I think that's a bit of a philosophic question that I'm not sure we have a complete answer for yet. I think Wes did a really good job of explaining to you very honestly the impact of therapy and the improvements, though not cures, that are present when you treat MPS 1, you palliate it with bone marrow transplantation. So we added conditions that were not evident at birth, and that's something like what we'd always done before. Most of the disorders that were on our old legacy panel were not things that were evident in birth, and these fit in that same paradigm. May have early onset or infancy is, well, so you could hedge and say, well, not all the ones we were screening for before were that early in onset. People used to not be too fussed or bothered if you didn't diagnose PKU for a couple weeks because it really takes a little longer than that to cause a problem. So there are ones that we were testing for before that the sooner they're diagnosed, the better probably, but you know, if you waited 2 weeks, it wouldn't matter. If you waited 6 months, it probably would. Where in that spectrum we would have to draw that line, I don't think we know. And effective treatments. Well, honestly, I think this was present for varying degrees in our legacy panel before. And we added everything because of one test, the MS-MS, but I don't think we had ever systematically checked or thought about whether some of the disorders that we identified, even as primary targets, were significantly influenced by newborn screening. Particularly early onset organic acidemias, where kids are almost always in crisis by the time the diagnosis is made or the newborn screening panel results come through. So the emergent quality of these things is quite variable. Pompe, I think we've got a pretty decent case that that's an emergency for many of the most severely affected kids. I think it's less so for MPS 1, and I think as we add more, we're going to have increasingly a wider spectrum of what's acute. All right, so what's different with the conditions that we've been adding here? Well, the timing of therapies. You heard even for MPS 1, when you're going to be really acute in its management, it might take months to initiate therapy. Pompe, I think people are pretty acute in adding it, but I think there's going to be quite a variation as we add other lysosomal storage diseases. And I'm just going to put it out there. Who the hell knows when you're going to have to treat Fabry? Honest to God. Okay. All right, timing of therapies. So that's different. We don't know. It's not something where you're going to call them into clinic and put them on treatment. It's going to be a process. The effectiveness of therapies, I think, is also quite variable. I've already, I think, elucidated some reservations about this piece of it. And can somebody tell me how we're treating Niemann-Pick? Any answers for that one? Okay. All right. Cost of therapies. I don't even know where to start. You know how much it costs to do a bone marrow transplant? A conservative estimate, $150,000, $200,000, and that's a one-time treatment. You know, that's not like all the infusions or whatever. You know how much the infusions cost? You don't want to know what the infusions cost. They're expensive. And so how do we utilize our resources most efficiently? I don't know the answer to that. The timing of the onset of the manifestations of the condition is highly variable. I think one of the things that was pretty true for the legacy test is most of the conditions really had their onset in the first months of life. Obviously, we've heard a lot about the variations that we're going to see where some of these disorders may not ever have onset of manifestations or may have them only in adult life. So that makes these a very different can of worms. We just added one more, and as we just added just one more, when we added Pompeii and then MPS 1, I guess that's 2, we really kind of fell down a slippery slope. I'm so proud of my animation ability. It took me, I had to go through them all to find the one where he was falling down. Well, but it is a slippery slope because as we add more and more disorders, I think we have to be really careful about what newborn screening is and what it does. And you know that there are disorders on the horizon for which there is no therapy and never will be. And is that what we as a society want to do? I'm not answering that, but I think we need to talk about it. All right. So, new variations on older paradigms for inclusion in newborn screening. The original intent for newborn screening was to have conditions with demonstrable impacts on early treatment, And I would say some yes, some no for the new ones that are adding. And I'm kind of veering off on the whole spectrum, not just the 2, MPS 1 and Pompeii. Some of our old ones didn't either, so maybe, we shouldn't be so righteous about it, okay? I don't know whether you really make a big difference to somebody with propionic acidemia. I don't know that. We want to add conditions with effective treatments, and I guess, again, some yes and some no for the new ones. But some of our old ones, not so much either. How effective were we? And we still don't know how those turn out also. So I came out really harsh, and then as I made myself think about it, I realized these are questions we've been dealing with all along. We're just adding to the complications that we've been needing to think about and be honest with ourselves about in all of them. All right, so what's the really big difference to me in this? And that's this. This is the impact of adult onset conditions and the corollary, their timing for their interventions. That's my one. That didn't stay lined up, but you get the idea. It's our 800-pound gorilla. And I think that's a really big problem for all of us as we contemplate as clinicians and as public health professionals how we're going to deal with following up for the adult onset conditions. We've already started to kind of talk about this when we say, well, what do you do about the late onsets? I don't think we have a clue what to do. So, all right, a side issue, and I'm just going to throw this out. Obviously, when we added MS, we got a whole bunch of secondary conditions for which the evidence was not as good, but we got them anyway. And so people said, well, should we report them? Should we not? Everybody says, well, there's no, call them secondary conditions, and you can choose whether you want to report them. And some people did, and some people didn't. They were tag-along, sort of. For SCID, we kind of got the same thing. Other T-cell immunodeficiencies. The target was X-linked SCID, but we got a lot of other stuff. Some of which is really valuable. So I don't think anyone wants to say we shouldn't have done anything with secondary conditions, but we don't talk about them very much. We all get excited about the primary targets. Now, for X-linked ALD, we haven't really talked about that here, but it's certainly, because it's queued up in the Secretary's queue, it's going to be added. People are going to do it. And we're going to detect a whole bunch of disorders of peroxisome biogenesis, and they won't be treatable. There won't be anything you can do for them. And so I'm just going to throw this out as a possibility. Should we be thinking about adult onset variants of the lysosomal storage disease conditions as sort of secondary targets, even though they're ostensibly the same enzyme problem? Would we do better to characterize our thinking and follow-up and planning of those as secondary targets and have people make conscious decisions about whether they want to report secondary targets? I don't know the answer to that, but maybe that would shift our thinking about it a little bit, because that's really what they're more like. All right, now we have the additional complication of legislative mandates, and several of you are painfully aware of the complexities of this. Thank you for your generous contributions to our knowledge about this. I so much appreciate how hard people have worked to improve knowledge in this area when it was not what they asked for, and it might not have been the best way to take care of kids. But when you had it handed to you, you took care of it, and congratulations for doing such an excellent job. I'm really impressed. It's really hard to do that. So we added some additional conditions, and you've heard some about those. The problem with these is these were added without the standard evidence reviews, and I think for that reason they don't fit as well into our established criteria, and it makes all of us real uncomfortable. At least it makes me uncomfortable. I don't know about you. I guess the thing that bothers me most about some of these is that we may not have effective treatments for some of them. And also we have the gorilla versions, the late onset subtypes, variable presentations, limited intervention. We kind of threw it out there, and now we have to deal with the broken eggs. We just got to sweep them up and see if we can scramble them back up into something tasty. All right, so the second round of implications. Where do we go from here? We added conditions with late onset and poorly characterized long-term interventions. We added conditions by legislative mandate without evidence review and have to deal with the consequences of that, because once we've identified them, they're there. For this reason, we have no current knowledge of timing or acuity of utility of early interventions, and we don't have any current infrastructure for long-term follow-up. It doesn't exist. All right. Well, we won't be able to do this. I looked for a horse that ran out of the barn, and then I found this one. I said, oh, it's more like that. We can't push the elephant back into the barn. It's sitting out there, and it's just going to be there. So we have to take care of this. This is our job. We have to do this, and we have to do it in the most responsible and scientific way we can. It's the cards we got dealt, and now we got to play with them. All right. So what are our mutual responsibilities? Because that's what they are. They're something that happens to all of us. Well, we got public health, we got clinicians, we got researchers, and we've got the families or advocates. All of these people have responsibilities in this. Where do we start? All right, well, public health. Many of you here are very aware of the role of public health in newborn screening systems for new conditions. You've committed yourself to accurate and reliable testing, improved methodologies, second-tier testing, all of the things that make the testing meaningful, useful, and as least invasive as it can possibly be. You know that responsibility, and you know how to do that right. And that's part of what we've heard about today. The second piece, though, and we talked a little bit about this, or I've been talking a little bit about this in sort of a side conversation, is long-term follow-up. And here's a place where we kind of have a problem, because it varies from state to state where long-term follow-up lives. Long-term follow-up isn't always part of a unified program with testing. And when it isn't, and there's a disconnect, there isn't always the sense of responsibility between the two halves that they belong together. I can't make that better. There's a wide variation from state to state. Some people do it magnificently, and other labs say, well, we don't have anything to do with that. We give them the test results, and then people do things. You know where you fit in that spectrum. But that means there's a wide variation in the duration of follow-up and the nature of services that are available for follow-up. And that's a big, big problem. So whose job is it? I don't know. And we're going to have to figure that out, because if we thought we had a problem before, we have a bigger problem now. All right, well, clinicians, we have both primary providers who have to learn about this and specialty providers who have to provide services. So as individual providers, who's the best person to provide this care? How do you identify the right providers? How do you get the neurologist to sign on for all the neurology things? How did you get the immunologist to sign on for the new SCID stuff? How do you mobilize the communities so that they know that this is their responsibility? And so this is an important task that is shared, I think, between clinicians, professional organizations, and public health. So professional organizations also have a really important role in education in defining treatment protocols and guidelines. And I didn't know what else to call this. Who does what for who? We have to really establish this, and I think just as we needed to be just in our application of newborn screening availability, we need to find some ways to establish justice in the care of the children. All right, so the foundation for all of this has got to be the families. That's why we're doing it. It's the babies and their families. So public health clearly has a role in all of this activity, and clinicians do too. And they intersect in their needs and what needs to happen for families. But really, we need research for clinicians and public health researchers to come together to do this better. This is all of us. We are all responsible for making sure we have this information. And so I don't know how that's going to happen, but it's what we have to do. We have to do research. Research is a diligent and systematic inquiry or investigation into a subject. That means systematic and diligent. I think we can do both of those things, but it is not easy to do. So newborn screening research is at the intersection. It's in a unique place for research, unlike almost any other research endeavor, because it's part of the intersection between standard research and public health. Because newborn screening has been assigned as a critical public health responsibility, data about newborn screening is critical for a whole variety of actions. It's important for surveillance of lab performance and the utility of screening. You have to know you're doing the job the right way. You have to know what the service needs are there to optimize care and outcomes, and you have to do research to improve testing, management, and new treatments. That's, by the way, the different HHS agencies. Each of them has a role in this. They all belong, and no one of them can do it alone. If they don't talk together and they don't work together, it isn't going to happen. So it's a good thing they mandated that by law in the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act. I don't know how I think it's been more effective than people had hoped. All right, newborn screening research is a process not based on single events. We have to improve existing tests. So we have to know, are we doing the best we can to find cases and not overcall? And a lot of what we talked about today is that. And I'm just so grateful that people do have that as such an important priority. Speaking as a person who gets all the extra results, the better you do, the happier I'm going to be. Thank you. All right, we're going to have new tests because I think we're going to find that these aren't the only disorders we're going to have to deal with. So we have to have research on tests, and all of you have been aware of the complexities that we are now facing because of the modification to the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act with Section 12 and the access to spots. Here's where we're not so good at it. Outcomes after testing. Did we choose the right tests to do? I think we're getting there, but we're still working on methodologies to choose the optimal one. Here's the hard part. Did early detection result in improved outcomes? And here's where we really haven't gotten as far as we need to go. Can we improve care for newborn screening conditions? Can we optimize management? Are there new treatments we can apply? Well, we can't do that without systematic gathering of information. All right. So advances in knowledge are balance. Public health research is honestly a responsibility of the population and the general good. But we also have this responsibility to individual persons identified by screening. So we have to improve outcomes for each person that we find. That's a tension that's very difficult to reconcile at times. So what do we have to do together? This is in my humble opinion. That's one of those internet things. All right. We're going to have to invest in long-term follow-up data collection and maintenance. Bottom line. We're going to have secure public health databases for tracking positive cases, and they can't just be, they're going to have to be uniform in their formats. And we're going to have to be able to share or compare information somehow. I'm not sure exactly how you do that and maintain privacy, but we're going to have to find some way to use everyone's experience. Things like sample sharing are a wonderful example of how of how we've been able to advance this kind of thing, but it has to be taken to the next level. So I think we're going to have universal common data elements for shared use by all stakeholders, both in a short and long-term sense. And the other thing we have to do is we're going to have to bite the bullet and say genotyping is a part of every assessment. I don't think we're honestly going to understand these disorders until we have genotyping available. And so the faster we understand that and the better we can combat people who are frightened by it, the better off we're going to be. All right, and now it's clear, no matter how well we did with a 5-year follow-up, it's not enough. It never was, and it certainly won't be going forward. We have to have, I don't know how else to call it. We can't just call it long-term follow-up. We have to call it longer-term follow-up. We have to develop, test, and follow protocols for management. People talked when we talked about how when they were doing it as a pilot phase, everybody was doing it the same, but then we had to things kind of floated away a little bit. That's not going to help us very much. And I don't know how we as a community make that happen, but we're going to have to find some way, something like Children's Oncology or some analogous organization, to help people be able to do things in ways that we can test the differences and really see if we can make improvements. So we have to collect, analyze, and publish outcomes. And I think we honestly need to reassess our decisions to include conditions, although that'll be harder when they've been mandated. It'll be very difficult to undo those things. I'm going to put in a pitch now for the Newborn Screening Translational Research Network, because that's what it was for, and that's what it should be still for. They're supposed to help enhance resources for investigators who want to improve newborn screening, new technologies for new conditions, and for new treatments and management approaches. People are pretty familiar with the tools. The VRDBS, the dried blood spot repository, is one way to make sure you have samples, but I'm going to really put in my pitch for the LPDR, the Longitudinal Pediatric Data Resource. The Joint Committee of the NCC and NVSTRN Clinical Research Network put together a bunch of really fabulous clinicians who did their best effort in good conscience to try and create uniform data sets for all the legacy conditions. And I think to a large extent they succeeded very well. I was fortunate enough to be able to adopt all of that and apply it in our group, many of whom are in this room. Some of the people who've helped us make this happen are together, where we're trying to collect information about at least the legacy tests in a systematic way. So what current tools are available? Here's our current progress. We do have common data elements for all those initial metabolic conditions. So we have almost 2,000 subjects on whom we are collecting data. About 44% of those are kids with MCAD or PKU. And that's not too surprising. Those are the most common disorders. But we're doing our best to kind of catch up with everybody. So the NBS-TRN had a lysosomal storage disease work group. They were working partly on behalf of a grant that was held by Melissa Wasserstein and supported or used NBS-TRN resources. And they created, and they've been able to finally finalize common data elements for MPS I, Fabry, Gaucher, Niemann type A and B, Krabbe, and Pompe. They haven't yet been deployed, but they're there. And so I think we have the opportunity to extend our knowledge about those disorders if we try and collect uniform data. They don't have one for X-linked ALD, obviously, and that needs to come pretty quickly because we're going to all be faced with that pretty soon. But I think our opportunities exist to collect uniform data. Whether we are collecting the right data in there, I can't promise you, but we'll do our best. So what are the challenges to success for this? Well, we need to work towards consensus. This is very time-consuming work, and we're already behind, in some cases, in being able to start collecting information. We need to formulate the hypothesis on which our queries will be based. That is, what questions are we trying to answer with the data? I mean, some of it's self-evident. Are the kids doing better when they're 5 years old? That's a hypothesis. I mean, you can build questions based on that kind of question, hypotheses based on that kind of question. Now, here's the problem. Data accumulation is expensive. It takes time to gather it, time to enter it, and time to analyze it. This is all costly. So we're going to have to think really hard about strategies and options for funding and see what kind of activities can be promoted, because it's not just a gorilla in the room. It's not just the elephant in the room. It's our whale. It's a whale. It's going to be a whale of a problem to be able to continue to sustain and support this. So our final implications for you. We signed up for a bigger, more permanent job when we added these new disorders, but we always had that, by the way. We always had that job. We just didn't do it particularly effectively. Keeping up with persons identified with late-onset disorders will require a new and complex infrastructure that we currently don't have. We just don't have it. And we're going to have to think together as a community about how we accomplish that and how, in the same way, we over-medicalize individuals or interfere with their appropriate privacy. But we do owe it to ourselves and the kids, advancement in knowledge, some follow-up and new treatment. We owe that to them. So what can you do? Well, we can continue to advocate for research support in any, and I would extend that to say, work with your newborn screening advisory committees in your states to help them bring this forward as the responsibility of the program, not just the testing. We would ask you to consider participation in active projects and to work together with your clinicians to develop new knowledge in testing, management, and treatment. We have to support structures for long-term follow-up because our job is to help realize the promise of newborn screening to save lives and improve outcomes. That's why we're doing this in the first place. And I was kind of going to be all doom and gloom, and that as I thought about it, in the end, we're still doing the same job, which is we're trying to make babies better. And we just have a lot more work to do. We knew that. All right, I'd just like to thank the people who work with me on the Inborn Errors of Metabolism Collaborative and the NBS-TRN for the stimulating and thoughtful consideration of this complex problem. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'd love to have people's thoughts on this, because this is not an easy task, not a simple task. But then most of the stuff we haven't been doing is not that easy anyway, so it'll just be more fun. Think of it as fun. All right, that's it. Yeah, Lou?
A lot of what you're describing about this disorder sounds like it might be research, not in clinical medicine. Do you think that's fair to say? And does that mean we have to look at a whole new set of consents? And what are the implications of that?
That's really a tough question. I think that's really an important question. Honestly, systematic gathering of knowledge is research. And that makes it really harder because it's very difficult to apply that. I think we're going to have to look towards the continuing strategies for central IRBs to try and help facilitate something like that. And I know that not every clinician will be able to take the time and effort to do this. I understand that. But when we can, we should. If we don't do research, the alternative is to kind of stumble along as we have. And so while I acknowledge the complexity of it, I think we're going to have to bite the bullet and do it. Go ahead.
One thing that I think that's left out in a lot of this is some of the ethical, legal, and social implications
Yes.
of what we're doing. And I think a lot more effort has to be placed into what about the medicalization of people, what about their insurance issues when they now you've identified an adult onset disease, newborn, and has no life insurance or whatever. These are things that are not on a lot of the table. And I think that's
I think those are critical costs to society, more than just financial costs. And as we do research in this area, because we have to, we should be equally responsible about doing research about these impacts. Go ahead, Ari.
So one of the, I guess, benefits of having this is if we can formulate a system that we can educate the parents about what to look for in their children who may develop the signs, but they're not picked up just because they don't know. I mean, they see them as normal children.
Yeah.
But that delayed walking, or that they just are not as active as others. I mean, there has to be a way to kind of use this information. I mean, this is all new to us. So the patients who have late onset Pompe disease, by the time that we see them, the treatment is ineffective.
Right.
So definitely early treatment will be good for them, but the point is,
when is it going to be? Yeah, I don't think we're going to know that. It's the same thing I think is when we had our discussion in Minnesota about whether to add all of the additional disorders, and there were some who argued that the sooner you treated Fabry, the more likely you were to prevent the long-term consequences. But when do you start? And how do you start? And how much treatment is required? It was really, really difficult for anybody to even begin to speculate on. And so unless we're systematic about planning that, even acknowledging that it might be A, expensive, or B, we might miss the target, I don't think we'll be able to know the answer to that.
I have a question about cost effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
What is cost effectiveness? Is for example, transplant for patients where transplant may lead to,
GVHD, skeletal difference. I don't know the answer to that. Several $100,000 a year for a lifetime. I don't know. I don't know. And those are answered. And it's when she said we have to have a responsible conversation about the ethics. Well, to the extent that they can publish it, they've been pretty aggressive about doing it. But I'm not sure that anybody's ever going to treat Hurler with enzyme replacement therapy alone. I don't think that's going to happen, particularly once you've got newborn screening. And again, this is, I think, the elephant out of the stable. I think now that we've agreed we're going to do newborn screening for MPS I, we're not going to know the answer to that. Go ahead.
Well, and I think one of the things that I know we struggle with in terms of short-term follow-up and our state advisory council is how to engage the broader public. Often the voices we hear from families are families who are affected, and
right.
Obviously they would have rather had this information when their baby was born. But the broader public, who often isn't aware that their baby had a newborn screening test, needs to be engaged. And I honestly don't know how to get them interested in newborn screening, but they need to be, because a few of them are going to be significantly impacted, as you were saying, in terms of potential adult onset conditions and all of the ramifications of identifying disorder that we're not sure how to treat.
I think we did a misstep by not being much more aggressive about education before everything blew up in terms of privacy advocacy. And if we had been doing a better job all along in education, it wouldn't be quite such a difficult barrier to extend that societal knowledge about the impact of late onset diseases. But we can't go back and educate people. We can only go forward and try and do a better job now. I know APHL and New Steps and others have been taking this on as kind of one of the things that they have a responsibility for. I think professional organizations also have a responsibility, but it's a tough nut to crack. I got lots of metaphors, similes. It was fun. I could find all these pictures on Google. As soon as we can deploy the data sets, yeah. Why not?
What about the late onset, so the mutations that may be associated with late onset in the patients who have variants of unknown significance and all that?
I mean, we'll gather the information, whether it'll take years to have results.
So the positive biochemical electroanalysis
part of the thing about our system that you correctly identify is that we're only supposed to enter things where we have an identified case. And I think if someone has 2 mutations in a demonstrable gene, we'll probably accept that as meeting the definition, even if they are likely to have late onset or minimal onset.
going to be able to know?
I think we have to put them in.
Will be in those cases. There has to be data that's where they're following.
Somebody's following them. Somebody's got to follow them. Uda.
This has come up a couple of times. There is a huge effort underway, right, sponsored by NIH for a couple of years that to put all of the variants into SwimBar.
Right.
Gigantic project that's been underway for a couple of years. And there are people who meet every 2 weeks on the phone and discuss the variants for metabolic.
Yeah, and one of the things I've talked to them informally about, but which we need to formalize, is finding a way to port the data from ours and link it to ClinVar, because we have a bunch of kids with clear biochemical phenotypes, and we make the clinical diagnosis of their disorder. They have the disorder by all our means, and then we have variants of unknown significance, but we know that they're significant because they've got the disease. So it's a little easier in the biochemical one because you've got a different way to prove that somebody has the disorder.
I did bring up a little example because we had a patient with frank MSD, and he got diagnosed as a variant of unknown significance.
Yeah, but it isn't. You know it's significant. Of course. He has the disease. So, yeah, so we'll have to be a little clearer about providing feedback to move them from VUS into, oh, yes. Right? Yeah, it's tough. I think often labs don't get it. They don't get clinical information, or they don't have any way of gathering that information, so they have to go on what they see. And the only way you iterate that knowledge is by providing feedback and letting them reclassify. I think that's going to have to happen, so ClinVar is an important piece of this. Oh, smile, people. It's not that bad. It's going to work. We're going to make it happen. All right. That's it for me.